Hello, it's Harry Brook here, Ag Fieldman for Flagstaff County, and today we're talking to Dan Johnson. He's a professor at the University of Lethbridge, specializing in grasshoppers, and he also teaches courses with data analysis and biogeography. He's renowned for his expertise when it comes to grasshopper identification, biology, and control.
You're listening to the official podcast of Flagstaff County.
Dan, let's talk about grasshoppers because we had a really hot, dry summer last year, and I noticed numbers, at least in our county, were starting to be on the rise.
Yeah, thanks, Harry. I like talking about this. I have to admit, it's not my central area of research anymore, but it's still such a hobby that I spend the summers and the weekends out there checking the species and the ages and so on, just to keep track of what's happening. But your county and some of the ones around had really low numbers. I mean, of course, the province handles the survey, not us university people.
Yeah.
But we do a fair bit of modeling and backup to figure out what's happening to them. And there are shifts in species, and there are shifts in the timing. And what happens with a situation like the last 2 years is you start out really low, and they only have one generation per year. So if you have rangeland species, they might lay 10, 20 eggs, maybe not very many. But if you have pest species, they're laying, like some of them lay 40 at a time, and they do that 3 times. So if they have a perfect summer, they can shoot up pretty quickly. You only have to have a few percent survive to the next year to actually increase. And that's happening.
So was it a good summer and fall for grasshopper pest species to propagate?
In the south it was, but and a little bit in Peace. Peace alternates every other year lately. We're not quite sure about that exactly why, but in the south it was a good year for them. But the funny thing is, it wasn't good for all species.
Okay.
There were a couple of species that were well adapted to the particular sequence of weather we had. And they did some unusual things, like the two-striped grasshopper is a famous one that pops up once in a while. It's big and fat and green.
You see lots of them around.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a big eater. And in some years, you can actually go through the roadside with a net, and that's all you get. And that's kind of what happened in the south last year, 2021. It's a funny story, but I saw many miles of no grasshoppers. And then suddenly a few miles of so many that it was almost beyond belief, sitting on top of each other, but staying in the roadside grass.
Really?
Yeah.
That's different.
It's a very unusual situation. And, I would have told the county fieldmen and so on if I had seen them moving into fields, but they were just sitting there. And mile after mile. And Carmen Gay had the same. And
so what were they eating? Because being a drought, there wouldn't have been a lot there to eat.
There was a fair bit of brome and that sort of thing in the roadside, and they're partial to that. They do eat that. So there's a lot of funny things happening. And the other thing that happened was right next to Lethbridge, of all places. Lucky for me, because I'll drive all day to go to a good grasshopper spot, but it was right next door.
Easy.
On the west side of Lethbridge, the city butts right against agricultural land, and the grasshoppers were basically uncontrolled because they weren't a problem lately. And then suddenly they just exploded, and they moved into people's yards. They ate their gardens, they ate their lawns. And it was a nightmare. It was on the news just about every day. The funny thing that happened though was it started finally to drizzle. So I went out to those spots, and there were thousands and thousands of dead two-striped grasshoppers up on the vegetation, filled with fungal spores that attack only the two-striped. There's one that kills the two-stripe primarily, and it was very, very prominent. So there are cycles in nature, but they don't necessarily save us.
No, it doesn't work for our benefit, right? Necessarily.
Not always. But sometimes there's been a few times in the past where a natural enemy of the pest will come along and just wipe them out. But usually the pest is playing catch up. So the enemy of the pest is playing catch up. So the pest typically will reach higher numbers. And then the enemies of the pest will surge a year or two later. Some people will say, oh, look, it's bringing them down. Well, sometimes, but often they're just following. They're just following. And so if it takes 10 or 20, 30%, great. That helps. That helps a lot. But it's not very often that it solves a problem. What solves a problem typically is the right kind of weather. But that's not even simple because it's the sequence of weather. And now lately, we have the added feature that extremes of weather are driving it. So you can have an extreme that is greatly to their benefit. So we underpredict,
Right.
Or you can have an extreme that wipes them out.
I mean, like the wet conditions in 2020. I know it wasn't necessarily wet down in southern Alberta, but central Alberta was pretty soggy until about middle to late July.
That's right. And if that hits them at the right time, then it interferes with their reproduction. It encourages their diseases and so on. But in 2021, we had that hot weather.
Yeah.
Very unusual stretch of hot weather.
So early.
And high and for days and days and days. And that gave them a boost because during that period, they basically had 100% survival. They weren't really dying off. And their natural enemies kind of hadn't had a chance to build up. So they weren't taking away either. So it's an interesting story because it's complicated. And then of course, the other side is that most of the species of grasshoppers that we have are not pests at all. They live out on the pasture in the rangeland and all they do is feed birds and turn over nutrients. And so you don't really want to remove them. And for one thing, it would be a waste of money, but another is it's not bad for, it's not good for the environment, for the birds and so on. So it's a mix. And that's why years ago, I thought, you know what, in addition to the other things I'm going to do, I'm going to learn every one of these things. I'm going to learn all of them and I'm going to learn the ages and I'm going to keep track and, year to year in my mind. So I've done that. And it's the interesting thing is you still get surprised, right? You still get really surprised by some of the things that happen.
So there's only about 5-6 species of actual pest species out of how many in the province?
If you collected them all, including the really rare ones, we would have about 90.
Holy cow. And so there's only about, is it 6 or 5 species that would be pest ones?
It varies. Usually it's 3. Sometimes it's as much as 6 or 7. You're right. You're absolutely right. But some of those pests won't be a pest for 10 years. And then suddenly they'll come back because the right conditions. So there's a few surprises all the time.
I noticed because when I worked at the Ag Info Center, we would, get calls about people with bad problems with grasshoppers looking for control. And there was the weird ones that were showing up where it was skippy years. So they have 1 year of real bad grasshoppers. Next year, you'd expect it's going to be a problem. Nothing.
Sure.
And then it follows the 2 years later, all of a sudden they got the problem again.
That does happen, and it's a strange thing. But the other side of this is you might even be looking at different species. And some of them have dietary preferences that are so strong. Like, we were discussing one time, 2001, 2002, 2003, that there's a grasshopper called the clear-winged, which is kind of yellow and brown. And it really just eats plants in the grass family, like wheat, barley, pasture grass. And it just exploded. And it exploded so much that when I went up the year before, I actually put out a news release on it. It's coming. But of course, nobody wants to hear it may or may not arrive.
Yes. It's kind of like, and by the time it gets to them, the ones who realize it's a problem.
Yeah.
And it's exploded.
But the funny thing about this one was 99%, probably, maybe even more, of the grasshoppers that were there all over the roads and fields were just one single species, which is an odd situation because normally you have a nice mix of species. Some are pests, some aren't. Some are staying on the range, some aren't.
Right.
Some are just feeding birds, some aren't. Some actually eat weeds. There's one that eats kochia and Russian thistle.
Do we need more of those?
Yeah, we do. Yeah. If you go down to places like Etzicum, you can find them by the hundreds sometimes, but they're not so prominent for the north, although I've seen them up as far as Jenner.
Okay.
Certainly.
So they're kind of moving north.
Anyway, and if we could ever figure out what causes them to choose those weeds as their food item, that would be interesting stuff. Maybe we could actually control them or release them or something, but that's far in the future.
Yeah. Well, you think of it, you've got to, as long as you want to keep working, there's always going to be more work. or in your hobby?
Well, there's certainly surprises. Yeah, there's certainly surprises. Like you mentioned this every other year life cycle of some of them. That's been happening in the north for about a decade now.
Okay.
And I've gone up and collected and brought them back to check their parasites, because down here in the central zones, like where you are, and in the south and in Saskatchewan and so on, most grasshoppers will have anywhere from 2 to even 20% with maggots internally.
Okay.
And then those maggots emerge from the grasshopper. They dig a hole right through the side, come out, pupate, and fly. And it's a fly. It looks very much like a housefly, but anyway, it's in a different family. But nonetheless, I wanted to find out what parasites they had up in Peace River.
Mm-hmm.
So I spent a couple of summers driving up sort of as a holiday and collecting, and then one research year as well. And you know what? They didn't have any at all.
None?
None. And it's probably because of the 2-year life cycle that they escape their parasites.
So they've almost, because of the weather conditions up there, they've almost select that kind of a survival?
It could be luck, right? Because this particular one down in the mountains of Colorado way back in the 60s was shown to have a 2-year life cycle, and maybe in the north they have adopted that. But if you have a lot one year and none the next, and a lot the next year and none the fourth, the natural enemies that have a 1-year cycle are out of luck.
Exactly.
It's a little bit like the cicadas, like the 17-year cicada.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them have other prime numbers, and they avoid their predators that way. They only come out on a prime number, and then there's so many that the predators are swamped, and then the predators show up the next year in numbers.
There's nothing to eat.
There's nothing to eat. Yeah, that's right. So that's happening on a small scale with grasshoppers and their enemies.
Okay, so what was the species up in the Peace region that was doing this?
Well, the main one that's got this 2-year oscillation is called Brunner's.
Yeah.
And it's got a lot of interesting things about it. One is it's a poor flyer. So I've been comparing them in different regions in North America, comparing their DNA, and they have been separated for a long time. So they are behaving slightly differently in the different zones.
Okay.
Another funny thing about them is years ago, some of the first DNA work on grasshoppers by Bill Chapko at the University of Regina found that of all the species we have, this one, Brunner's, it's called Brunner's spur-throated grasshopper. It's the closest to the old Rocky Mountain locust that
Really?
they had in the 1800s, right? Because that thing was so massive. There's trillions and trillions of them pulled up, and then it went extinct. Very last one was collected in 1903 in Treesbank, Manitoba, by the famous entomologist Norman Criddle.
Okay.
And some collections don't even have any of them because they were so common that they didn't bother.
Why collect them, right?
Yeah, they're hardly pinned. It's an amazing story.
Why would they go extinct?
That's been a debate for a long time. In the 40s, somebody felt it was a combination of climate and all the low-lying valleys that were planted to alfalfa and things like that really weren't a preferred food for them. But I kind of don't buy that, because I can understand why they would drop down to a rare species.
Yeah, but not just disappear entirely.
Yeah, that's right. Just totally gone. And other people say, well, they're still here, but there were 2 subspecies and one died out and the other one remained. Well, not really. I mean, if you look at the anatomy and the DNA, that doesn't add up either. So there's 2 massive extinction events in biological history in North America that are always on people's minds. People who study these things. And that's one of them, the Rocky Mountain locust. The other one is a passenger pigeon.
Yeah.
But we know how they died.
Well, it's just hunted out of existence.
They ended up in millions of pigeon pot pies and so on.
My specialty, yes.
But the Rocky Mountain locust in the 1800s, 1848, 1870s, and so on, they were just massive numbers. In fact, one year they flew. There was a Northwest Mounted Police division called F Troop, which I find kind of amusing, and they actually,
remember that TV show.
and they and some of the other mounted police encampments were so inundated by Rocky Mountain locusts that their tents were eaten.
Whoa, cotton, I guess.
And some of the Red River cart people couldn't even water their horses in Manitoba because the lakes were so full of billions of dead locusts.
Wow.
There's
I guess we're kind of lucky for that extinction happened.
If that one was still here, ours would hardly even show on the graph.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was amazing. Well, the old stories like Little House on the Prairie where the
Oh, I remember
laundry,
reading those. Yeah.
laundry's eaten off the line, the shovel handles
Yeah.
are eaten, the fence posts are eaten. Yeah, that was all true. Yeah,
Hmm.
it
And
sounds made up.
it's fairly closely related to the Bruner.
It is, and it's also closely related to the lesser migratory grasshopper, the little gray one
Oh yeah.
that was so prominent in the 30s. Millions and millions of them. And then again, it was prominent in the 60s and the mid 80s. We had a lot of them. But right now, it's very low numbers.
So their biggest problems at the moment tend to be the clear wing and the two stripe, it seems.
I think that's true. Some of the other ones are on the increase, but they're still low.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll be low for another few years. The reason it's hard to predict is if we have dry springs and summers,
Yeah.
then we will definitely have more grasshoppers. However, if we end up with more precipitation, then it could be that it'll encourage their diseases, and it could be that it reduces their egg laying. So it's a little hard to call because of the wild card is rainfall. When will it come, right?
Yeah, right.
It means everything when it comes. I remember, what was it, 1988, one of the driest years we ever had, but they had a really good cereal yield. Why? Rain came at the right time.
Well, and I've seen that too over the years. It's a function of yield is a function of moisture, but almost more importantly is the timing.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah. And not only with regard to plant growth, but with regard to seeding and then harvest. Remember all the years when they just couldn't get the crop off because it was wet or even snowed on?
Yes, I remember, was it 2016? That was a horrible harvest where they were basically didn't get in the field till November. And there was about a 10-day window.
Yeah, that
where
was
it was dry enough, and it was such short days too.
And I remember a couple of years in the past in which there was actually snow in August, and then they had to wait for that to melt, of course. And then later, when they did harvest, a lot of it was lodged. So the following year, I noticed there were so many short-eared owls. Like normally, if I see one, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
But in that area between about Fort McLeod and, say, Nanton, I saw a lot of short-eared owls just drifting back and forth in the sky. And I thought, what's going on? I suddenly realized with all that lodged crop, wheat and barley, I'll bet the mouse population.
Nice, so crazy.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. It pays to keep your eyes open, but I don't know what you can do with that information.
Well, it's kind of like you're seeing effect and consequences, right?
Yeah, exactly. And also the question of where they go when they're not here, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember this story, but I got the first call about it, and it was kind of shocking. There was a grasshopper control program in Argentina, and one day they went out and started picking up dead Swainson's hawks, and we care because that's an Alberta population that winters down in Argentina.
Yeah.
And they picked up 4,000 in a very short period of time, and they estimated 20,000 Swainson's hawks were killed because they were using the wrong grasshopper spray.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, up here they seem to exist mostly on Richardson ground squirrels.
Sure, and other small mammals, but they do eat grasshoppers too.
Okay.
I've seen some that ran into buildings or into the wind turbines or whatever, and then they opened up the crop and they're stuffed with grasshoppers. They thought, well, maybe they were killed by pesticide, but no, that's natural food. I mean, even coyotes eat grasshoppers.
Just to get enough of them, I guess.
Yeah, it's part of the food web. And grassland songbirds. We showed years ago with a big study that with Canadian Wildlife Service working with us, that 70% of the diet of the grassland songbirds that come back in the spring are grasshoppers. And none of those are pest species. So that's kind of an interesting story. Like there's really no reason to go out and spray the pastures and rangeland most of the time in Canada. Yeah. US though is quite different. They have huge losses on range from grasshoppers. So it's a function of climate.
Okay, so they've got, because they're further south, I guess, longer seasons, more opportunity for proliferation of grasshoppers.
And not only that, they have easily a dozen species that cause big economic losses on range down there that don't do anything here of any importance at all. So we're at the northern range, and I think that's what. Now that's not to say that one year out of 10 they can't be bad, because I remember out near Claresholm and Nanton and Staveley one year, the ranchers were telling me that it was overgrazed already before they put any cattle on. And it was because the grasshoppers that one year had exploded. But that was an unusual situation. That wasn't the normal rangeland species. That was the crop species building up such large numbers that they moved to rangeland, kind of the opposite direction of what most people think.
Yeah, right. So you're saying the two-stripe, it likes grass species.
Oh, that's a mixed feeder. Yeah, that's
okay.
The clear wing is really grass, and the two-stripe is they'll even eat alfalfa. They'll eat all kinds of things.
Whatever's available.
Sorry?
Yeah, whatever's available.
Yeah, canola even, they tend not to eat peas or green peas or chickpeas or that sort of thing, but we're not exactly sure why. But this Brunner's that you mentioned is basically it's from your area. It's from like Flagstaff area over to maybe Cold Lake, up to Athabasca, all the way into the Peace. It's very prominent in all that Buck Lake, Swan Hills. It's very common, and it, strangely enough, prefers thistle to crop.
Really? We've got lots of that.
So it will eat crops, and it will eat broadleaf crops very readily. It eats alfalfa, it's unbelievable. In the 90s, I saw it clean off whole fields right down to the ground. But if there's a wheat or barley field, they'll hang out on the roadside and eat the thistle. It's very unusual grasshopper.
Yeah. I read the booklet, which is excellent, by the way.
Oh, I got
on
a new
the
one.
Different species.
There's a new and better one coming out, but I gotta get off my rear end and get it done.
I was just thinking when can you expect that? Like, you see grasshoppers early in the spring. None of those are pest species, right?
The really early ones like March, April, no, those are never pests. And if they have a colored wing, they're never pests. And if they make any noise, they're never pests.
Right.
But you're right, though, the pests come in late May.
What I like about grasshoppers is, they start small. They're not going very far because they don't have wings until they're adults.
Yeah.
And if you are going to control them, well, they're a little easier to control if you get them in the first, second, third instars.
It's true. And if you don't get too early, then they've come out of the eggs, because when they're in the eggs, they're pretty well immune to whatever's going on above ground. Not nowadays, that is. In the old days, they weren't, because the pesticides last for a month.
Yeah.
Nowadays.
Oh, look at old stuff. Yeah. Kills everything.
Only the organochlorines were incredible. They would spray and it would last for weeks and weeks. Of course, it caused a lot of damage.
Kind of glad we're finished with those ones.
It's more scientific now. They have to time it and be aware. And it's great that people are aware of species.
Yeah.
I had a couple of very fond memories of being out in the field, and a farmer or rancher or somebody would stop me because they saw the net, and then they'd tell me the ones with the yellow wings that are large are not a problem. The little gray ones are not a problem. And they basically heard it from me, or they read it out of something I wrote. I was really pleased.
Well, it's gratifying to know that actually they remembered.
Yeah, well, they care. They care about nature. Everyone does, and you have to portion how much brain power you put to it, but it's worth it. It's worth it.
Oh yeah.
Same with plants. I mean, I would like to be better with my plants and birds, but there's not enough time in a day.
Well, and life's too short.
Yeah.
When you come right down to learn it all, but it's all fascinating.
Yeah, and organizations really help. I think they can do a lot, and they should. They owe it to the public. And now I know I didn't ask your permission, but I'm going to make a plug for the Entomological Society.
By all means.
The Entomological Society of Alberta is there with connected to a lot of knowledgeable entomologists and also amateurs who have answers to insect questions, and they can help. They can help. And one of our big objectives is to spread the knowledge of insects and other scientific topics to the public.
We need more education in that regard, especially as if you want to talk chemical control of insects. The real problem I have with a lot of them is they are just sort of carte blanche. They just kill all insects, and it tends to do more harm than good.
But it's getting better.
Yeah,
it's getting better. There's more, in recent decades, there's more and more science and more nuance, and also more and more integrated pest management. And I'm very optimistic that agriculture has a good future in terms of careful control that doesn't leave residue. I think we can definitely do that, but they have to have the people, the experts, do it. And I'm worried that the next generation is going to be lacking some of those people.
Well, hopefully you build it, they will come.
Yeah. Anyway, the Entomological Society of Alberta is just one. There's societies on every other topic. And like I say, I'm plugging it because I'm the president this year.
Well, and I noticed too that there's also apps out there that will identify, insects and weeds. Plants, I got one on my phone that PlatNet, which is actually pretty good.
Oh yeah, we're living in a wonderful period for that sort of thing. iNaturalist. I mean, anyone who has never seen it should definitely go to iNaturalist and look up the distribution of things.
Yeah,
I mean, not only interesting butterflies and grasshoppers and so on, but reptiles, amphibians, birds, and then also some misconceptions could be fixed. For decades and decades, I've had people come to me and say, I was bitten by a brown recluse. My doctor told me I was. And it's at first, but the first 10 or 20 years of this, I was polite. But now I just say, no, you weren't. unless you took a trip to Missouri or something like that.
Yeah.
No.
They don't come that far north at all.
No, they're not even in Montana, North Dakota.
Okay.
In fact, there was one in Minnesota, but if you go to iNaturalist and click on it, it says fell out of a FedEx pack. So it's worth getting to know them. I mean, spiders in Alberta, we don't really know how many species, but probably 700. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
If you go into a field out there where they're not using much in the way of insecticide, there's probably 20, 30 species of spiders that are just gobbling pests for the farmer for free,
Yeah.
Like in potato fields, there's so many predators out there that even if pest species come floating in and fall down, they probably are gone in a hurry.
Wow.
And that's going to be that way until we go back to heavy pesticide use. But so far we've been lucky. Like, for example, Colorado potato beetle, not a big deal in most places anymore. But if we do have an outbreak of that, then it'll cause a cascade of the other problems because we're killing the predators.
And we might actually cause more trouble than we're solving using.
Yeah, and the way to avoid that, of course, is monitoring and learning and having a photo guide, and that sort of thing.
Knowing what your thresholds are.
Yeah, and what you're looking at. So that's why I've got a new book planned. I've spent the last 10 years probably taking photos on the side, really good photos of the different stages, the different species, and I'm going to put that out. I suppose a dozen of us could get together and do a spider book and a beetle book and all that stuff. The research centers have got a lot of data on individual pests and the life cycles. But like I say, we're kind of all retiring or moving on, and
it's the age wave from the baby boomers, right?
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering what's going to happen here.
I know it's changing the subject a little bit. I've always been fascinated by the pathogenic fungi that attack grasshoppers, and now how it sort of takes over the brain, forces it to the top of some stem or other, where it clasps its leg and dies. And then it does a reenactment of the movie Alien, Poof.
Yeah, those are
so cool.
It is amazing. And if you dig into them with a microscope and a little bit of DNA analysis, it's even more amazing because you're talking about Entomophaga grilli, and it's found on every continent in the world. I've seen it in China, I've seen it in Africa.
Oh, yeah.
And there tend to be different pathotypes. So for some reason in the millions of years that they've been attacking grasshoppers, there's one style and species. Well, it's not species by species, it's more group or genus. Like, for example, in the whole Melanopus group, there's one that just forms a resting spore that lives inside the grasshopper. It's like a little time bomb, pretty good size, bigger than bacteria, perfectly round. And getting it to germinate is really, really hard. But in nature, it does. And it'll attack the following year. Very simple life cycle. But the clearwing grasshopper, it has an extra loop in the life cycle so that it actually forms a conidiophore, like a fuzzy surface on the abdomen of the dead grasshopper. Yeah. And then it builds these little conidia, like these little spores that are pear-shaped, and they build up a little water pressure behind them and they squirt and shoot out into the air. Yeah. You can see it on windowsills, or on windows rather. If you see a dead fly sometimes with a halo around it, that's a different genus of the same kind of fungus, and it spits those spores out under pressure, like a little bullet.
there's so much going on around us that we just don't seem to be, well, we're getting more aware of it, but
Yeah.
I love the whole field heroes idea when it comes to entomology. And
Yeah,
there's a lot of species out there that are working on our behalf, although we don't know it.
yeah, they have a good book on that everyone should take a look at. I'm kind of honored that they used a couple of my photos in there. But it's fantastic. We have to be aware of those things. And who knows, in the future, maybe we can even figure out how to encourage them.
Yeah.
But it's hope and a wish quite often.
Yeah. But what this coming year, because it was so dry, and I was thinking, the fall was ideal for laying eggs. It probably behooves people to spend some time walking around their fields and
just having a look. Yeah. And avoiding overreacting. That's the other side.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. Got to be in the middle, because you don't want to overreact and start treating everywhere that there's any at all, because first of all, they might not be the right ones. And secondly, they might go nowhere. To get a real outbreak going takes the right species, the right weather, the right sequence. And often there's a year or two and it looks like it's going to go, and then it sputters out.
Yeah.
And the province, Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, and also in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and in the USA, APHIS, they do a lot of surveying and a lot of mapping, and that's really valuable information.
Yeah.
But on top of that, we need all these little site investigations where we look at exactly what's happening with respect to their local ecology, and by ecology, of course, I mean the life cycle, the phenology, the development, the parasites, all that. So some people say, well, you could study it to death, but we're nowhere near that. We're not in danger of knowing too much yet.
Might take a while,
Yeah, the state, entomology, I love the fact that people care and people are trying, industry, government, universities, but if we treated diseases like we treat subjects like what you're talking about, pest control, we'd have like 3 or 4 doctors in the whole province treating everybody, plus they had to cure cancer at the same time. It just wouldn't happen.
No, wouldn't. It's but I guess as food sources, or I guess the whole food security becomes more important, I'm hoping that there'll be a little more attention paid to the various aspects of agriculture.
Yeah. Reliability as well as quality. Yeah, and it's all a tough problem now, of course, because of markets, globalization, and all this stuff. It's really become almost too hard to call.
What would be the biggest challenge for you, I guess, an extension of the information that you have? How to hand it off to the next generation? I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, for me, it's almost too easy. I hate to say it, but maybe because now that I've been around doing this for years, I've narrowed my scope or something. But okay, we publish scientific papers, but we're really we're just talking to other scientists.
Right.
So in a way, it almost doesn't matter. We make progress, but in a way, it almost doesn't matter. And lately, I'm thinking what does matter towards the end is to put down what you've learned in 30, 40 years into digestible guides, booklets, photo guides, summaries, put all that down and get it out there so that it doesn't just end up in the ground with me. That's not a very nice thought. I'm sorry. So I and hundreds of other people, and not just, you and engineers and everybody else, farmers that have long experience with quotes around experience, the older ones, they need to get it down somewhere so that it's useful.
Well, and I find too that things that go on the internet they don't necessarily exist for ever. Hell, they don't even exist for like 10 years sometimes. Because I know there's articles that used to be in Alberta Agriculture's website, and the vast majority of them have gone poof. They disappeared.
True. Yeah, it's a strange thing. It's organic, and it has not only some good stuff disappearing, but it has some bad stuff appearing.
Well, yes, I find that what becomes more valuable as you get older is the experience you can apply to the information you're reading. And then you can use critical thinking to determine whether or not how valid this statement is.
Sure.
And do further research. I've done that myself.
And if it's based on actual evidence,
Yes.
actual facts, and not just what we'd like to see, or what we assume somebody's doing to us or something.
Yeah.
So, evidence is all about evidence, and that's why I like in my spare time going out and just hiking at a new place. I went to the Antelope Creek Ranch last summer.
Oh yeah.
Had a good look on several occasions for the first time, and I was very impressed. They have so many species there, and they're not pest species. They're just supporting the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And like, had I tried to guess without going there, I could come up with all kinds of reasons for why I thought it was one way or another. But the only way to find out what was really there was to go and look and keep a notebook as I photographed and walked. So I guess I'm thinking, okay, I'm lucky with this group, but what about the next group that I don't know so well? I'm just I'm in the dark like everybody else. So I think we need to get some of these things written down.
Well, it's also important to have that surveillance, because despite all the information on the internet, things are changing. It's not the picture we see or that is reported on and we read about is not necessarily today. This could be 10 years ago. It's like your grasshopper book, right?
Yeah, I agree completely. And, you put your finger on something I thought I'd mention. People know Jared Diamond maybe from some of his other books like Guns, Germs, and Steel and all that. But he's got a book called Collapse. And in it, he says, when a society collapses or maybe part way, it's usually because they failed to detect a trend. And the reason they fail to detect a trend is it's going up and down, up and down, up and down as it's rising or as it's falling. Right. So every time it goes the other way, we say, oh, it's over, it's no problem. And so this is what we have with weather, with crop production, with pests. We have this zigzag that's maybe got a long-term trend, and it's hard for us to see that trend.
Which way she's going,
Yeah. So it's happening so many places, and I don't know the answer, but I think the answer lies in collecting the evidence and keeping it in records.
Well, I remember reading a long time ago how there was someone suggesting that collapse of a civilization is almost always through history related to food supply. Indirectly or directly, it could result in war but it's motivated by food supply and a shortage thereof.
Yeah, or other resources, not managing the resources in a sustainable way. Yeah. Easter Island and all these places, they all ran into big problems. And of course, maybe we're too big to fail. I don't know, but we can still have setbacks, big setbacks.
Think of the supply chain. We're so used to having everything just in time.
Yep.
And with COVID and associated transportation issues, all of a sudden we're realizing avocados don't grow in Alberta.
Yeah, and the rise of other nations that will maybe offer some competitive forces we hadn't expected 20 years ago. Yeah, there's all kinds of things happening. So in a way, I feel like I'm just plain lucky that I can focus on some of the little biological details that others don't care about too much. But that's what I do on a Saturday when I'm out. I'm so fortunate to have partners like Alberta Conservation Association. They've got a big project down at Silver Sage where they revegetated depleted land.
Okay.
And we're looking at the insects there. Like, what did they accept it as a new ecosystem? Are they back? Is it working with the plants? Yeah, things like that. Yeah. So I worked up at Cold Lake at the airport there, and there's a lot of interesting things that vary from region to region. Peace River is a fantastic place to work. I wish I could spend more time.
It's very unique because it is isolated from the rest of the agricultural area in the province.
Yeah.
And it has meant that they've been able to do things we couldn't do in central or southern Alberta because the pests.
And even your zone there southeast of Edmonton, that whole big stretch has got, even though people think of it as one big region, it's got such diversity in it.
Oh, totally.
Such diversity. It really needs more attention.
Well, there's more than one lifetime's work.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you, Dan. Is there anything else you want to talk about with grasshoppers?
Well, I guess I could talk about some of the details, but the one thing that would be a worthwhile take-home message is that for some reason, young people are quite excited about groups like this, and I think it's good to encourage it. We could have grasshopper watching among young students, and by young, I mean, under 90.
Everybody's a student, no matter how old you are.
Yeah, we can have grasshopper watching just like we have bird watching, and because they're always available. They're in different habitats. They're there all spring and summer and fall. And if you learn them apart, you suddenly go, wow, I didn't know there were so many types, and maybe that the ecosystem is diverse and complex. It's just yet another way to discover that. And of course, rare plants, that's another really good one. I think people really can't go wrong digging into that. I gave a little talk lately, and I had to come up with some take-home messages. And the first one I said was, learning is cool. It's well worth it for itself. And if the coming generation and also the one going out, if they all accept that, I think we'll all be better off.
Well, I think you grow old when you stop learning.
Yeah.
But if anybody had questions about grasshoppers, or maybe they had some pictures and they were wondering about them, could they email you?
Sure, but it's a little complicated right now. But in general, if they wrote, for example, to the Entomological Society of Alberta, they would just send it to me, and other specialists too. Like if someone found a strange moth or a beetle or wondering about what kind of bumblebees we have or whatever, if you write to a society like the Entomological Society of Alberta, then they pass it on to the experts we have. And we have an education committee too that's pushing all kinds of interesting topics. My dream for my little bit of time that I'll be in the executive is to encourage more young people to join. So I'm thinking of maybe setting up some complimentary student memberships. I'll talk to the others in the group and see how much they'll let me steer the ship for a while.
So what's the email address for the Entomological Society?
It's ESAlberta @gmail.com.
Simple.
Yeah, ESAlberta, Entomological Society. And by the way, the pathologists, the mushroom people and birds, they all have these things, and the public really should make contact with those societies because they want to help.
Well, and we used to have government services that would provide a lot of that, but ultimately, it's nice to know that we still have places we can go to answer the questions. And
sure,
every year you're going to get oddballs showing up.
And of course, provincial governments particularly, but also federal, but provincial governments particularly are really good sources of information. They're all there for people. But I do get the feeling, I'm not an insider anymore, but I get the feeling they're overworked lately, that they've got like one person wearing 5 hats.
There's not a lot of people left with Alberta agriculture. Like they're still looking for the provincial entomologist position is still open. And
there should be 10. I mean, if you compare it to the USA, for example. But I think that's true across Western Canada. Maybe there has to be some real hard budgeting. I don't know. That's not my area. I'm fortunate that I've almost never been an administrator.
I'm old enough to remember back when we used to have like 3 or 4
of everything.
Well, yeah, exactly. We used to have an agronomy unit, and
sure. Soils.
I guess those were luxuries. Just didn't seem like it at the time. And I mean, things changed too as far as availability of information.
Yeah, and there's a lot of dedicated people out there yet, but and I hope it stays that way. And I tip my hat to them.
Oh yeah. Okay, well,
there's a prairie-wide insect monitoring. There's disease monitoring. All those people. That's. I just hope they get what they need.
Oh, definitely. Well, thank you, Dan. I appreciate this time, and I thank you very much for it. And hope to see you around some tour some summer.
Yeah, it's good talking to you, Harry.